Welcome to our first virtual greenhouse grower update for ornamental producers in North Carolina. This is something we're trying out this year to try to bring information to everyone since we can't have our in-person meetings like normal. I'm Amanda Taylor. I work with NC State Cooperative Extension as the area specialized agent for greenhouse and nursery production in Western North Carolina. Everyone should have registered using the Google form that we sent out earlier. If you did not do that, you'll need to click on that link and go there to register. I'll put the link in the chat box here when Brian starts. If you need to get pesticide credits for the other sessions for Tuesday and Wednesday, you'll need to make sure that you have your camera on. So that's just a note in case someone doesn't have camera capabilities. You will need that for Tuesday and Wednesday's talk if you need credits. We'll have time for questions at the end. You can always type questions into the chat box as we go so you don't forget them. Or at the end, you can unmute your mic and we can ask questions directly to Brian. You were emailed a copy of Brian's presentation today, so look in your email for that. If you're an extension agent, I'll be sending that shortly. You registered via a different system, so I'll have to send that to you. And we will be recording today's session and posting it online. It'll be posted to the eGrow website, which Brian will mention here in a minute, but we'll send out an email to everyone who registered when we have that up. So you can go through and reference anything if you need to. All right, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Brian Whipker. He's our Floriculture Extension Specialist at NC State University.
Thanks, Amanda. So I want to welcome everyone here. So it's nice to be able to at least see everyone virtually for seminars, seeing how the travel's not really possible in most instances. And I have to admit, I'm getting antsy of being working only from home and not going out, although I still have access to the greenhouses. So plants are still my sanity that's helping out. So, for today's webinar, we're looking at abiotic disorders. So the idea is going over some of the common problems that one would see as kind of a preview before the season begins. So these are a number of the problems that we see year in and year out. So we'll talk about them, highlight what they are, what they look like, and some of the correction procedures that you could use to overcome them. So as Amanda said, we will put this on the eGrow website and we'll get started. So I do want to highlight that over the last few years, we have done an initiative with funding from the American Floral Endowment of doing a Dirt and Squirt portal. And so primarily Garrett Owen, who's now at University of Kentucky, and myself, along with some key grad students, actually in my case, both of them are former grad students. They've both graduated, have been working on this series. So we have about 50 different crop-specific set of recommendations. And as you can see in the kind of the area in the middle that has a folder, we're giving optimal pH ranges and optimal EC ranges along with fertility. And so depending on which fertility regime you're using or testing, if you're doing 1 to 2, SME, or pour through, the values are listed there. So it gives you kind of an all-in-one location for a specific crop. And in most cases, we have the symptomology of high and low pH and high and low EC. There's a few that we don't have all four, but it gives you a good overview of some of those crops. So everything's available at dirtandsquirt.com. It's a standalone Google site at this point, and very soon it will be migrating over to one of the pull-down menus off of the eGrow website. It should actually happen at the end of this week. So this is the basis of information that if you need to go look at some information, we have that on that website at Vert, Dirt, and Squirt. So there's videos for how to do different sampling procedures for different crops, and then these crops fact sheets. So to get started on some of the problems, now, if you're more in the southeast and along the northeastern area of the US, where you're not over limestone bedrock, we oftentimes face problems of low pH. It can be very catastrophic when you look, especially at the plant in the middle, the geranium, with the discoloration occurring in the plant. So there's a lot of different symptomology that goes on. So we're going to talk about the different types of symptomology and then what you do about it. So again, this is when the substrate becomes too low. And when that happens, nutrient availability, specifically manganese and iron, usually iron's the driving force, is taken up by the plant to toxic levels, and then you start seeing cell death, this discoloration happening in the plant. So you see a blackening or purpling. It's very common, something like Gerbera. And so oftentimes when it's more blackening, it's probably more of a reaction to manganese than it is to iron. So you can also see blackening here on ageratum. And then on some zinnias, it's kind of in between black and then some bronzing. And so zinnias will also be affected. And so then you can also have bronzing. And so it's very common to see that on a marigold. The difference is everything I'm showing you is on the lower foliage, not the upper foliage of the plant. And so consequently, it may look like it's a magnesium deficiency if it's bronzing, or you might think that if it was actually at the top of the plant, it would be an iron problem of an iron deficiency, but it's at the lower leaf of the plant. And then you see some bronzing here going on with a petunia. And then here's more of a highlight of looking at the initial symptomology of the upper right photo, getting more advanced, the lower right photo, and then the more extensive discoloration occurring on the plant on the left. So we can see that when this happens, and this is again, is when the pH is too low, you see this discoloration. And the real challenge is that once this starts, it takes a while to turn it around. So you lose 2 to 3 weeks in production of trying to revigorate that plant to get it to be sellable. And so for us in the Southeast, in North Carolina in particular, this is more of a catastrophic problem that's more difficult to overcome. And so therefore, it's better to try to avoid the situation from happening in the first place. Now, there are categories of plants that people say that are not affected by pH. And we have done some of this in looking at some of the studies over the last few years. And, in particular with this experiment that we did with petunias, we did not see any bronzing or blackening of the lower foliage, but you can see as the substrate pH went from 3.3 to 5.1, you could see that there was a general overall stunting of the plant. So there was lack of growth going on. So you don't always see symptomology. And in the case of here on hemp, we did not see the symptomology occurring either, but you saw the general overall smaller plant growth. And keep in mind also, when you look at the growth that's less on the top growth, the shoot, the same thing was occurring on the root growth of that plant. It was less extensive. And we found the same thing occurring with poinsettias. And so it basically is lack of good environment. We in particular on the hemp and also on this petunias or poinsettia study conducted leaf tissue analysis. And in both cases, the plant failed to accumulate enough iron and or manganese in the leaf tissue to get to the point of toxicity so you'd see symptomology. And just with a study that the undergrad researcher completed this summer, we did see that on hemp that if we did then overdose the plant with micros like 4x the rate, we were at least then at that point able to develop the symptomology. But the thought process is that there's an uptake pump going on, and when you lower the pH, the pump starts and it starts accumulating iron and manganese. And if there's not ample supply there, like an overdose condition, you'll never see symptomology go on in these plants. But it's not that they're not affected by low pH, they just don't show visible symptoms. So there still is an optimal range that people should be targeting for most plants. And for most floriculture species, 5.8 to 6.2 is good. 5.5 to maybe up to 6.5, as long as you don't have iron problems, are the target ranges. And again, going back to the crop fact sheets that we produce, we give those optimal ranges. And in all cases, we have the range, but then we brought it in 2/10 from that upper and lower limits to give a safe boundary for what that range would be. And so when you get in that last 2/10 at either end, that's when you need to start making changes to try to keep the pH within the range that you need it to be. So just also to point out that when the pH is low on the plants that show symptoms, we normally recommend that we're going to take leaf tissue samples from the upper foliage. And this illustrates here that if you took from the lower foliage also a sample, you can see how iron is about 6x higher, and also manganese goes up about 6x. So you can see that if you did 2 different tissue analysis, you could see that there was in fact accumulation in the tissue, and you can use that to help you diagnose the disorder, besides taking a pH sample. And a lot of times it depends on the species, but if you start getting south of 4.8, you're going to start seeing problems occurring. Some plants are 5.2. I've heard of some geranium crops, the pH is actually closer to 5.6 of having problems. That generally you got to get below 5.5 or below 5 to start seeing problems occurring with the plant. So when you do have a problem of low pH, what needs to happen before you start making radical changes? You really need to confirm that pH. Make sure your pH meter is calibrated and test the substrate to make sure it's where it needs to be. You can follow through on susceptible species by having that leaf tissue analysis sample going on also. Flowable lime or hydrated lime are the 2 most common corrective procedures used, and all those corrective procedures are listed on each of those fact sheets. The second to last page has all the corrective procedures. We put it in each one of those. So the corrective procedures to follow are written down there. We also have on the eGrow website this bigger poster that was produced. So if you have pH corrections of being at too low or too high, or the EC being too low or too high, what you need to end up doing. So that's also on that Fert, Dirt, and Squirt website that we have produced. So now we've talked about low pH. Let's go the other end of the spectrum. So elevated pH commonly happens mainly because the substrate pH is too high. And that a lot of times is because you're over limestone bedrock. So it's a real common problem for the Midwest and the Great Plains and the Prairie provinces, because that was all limestone. So that affects the alkalinity of the water, and the water that you're then irrigating the plant. So you're adding a little of like ground up limestone every time you irrigate. And if you do that, then gradually the substrate pH is going to increase on you. But also be aware that besides the pH being too high, there's other factors that can come into play. And that is if you're overwatering, there's root rots, cold growing, also can limit the uptake of iron by the plant. So you just got to know what you're facing and what is the root cause of the problem before you start making those corrective procedures. So here's a very classical example of interveinal chlorosis. It's on the upper foliage, whereas if the pH is too low, that same interveinal chlorosis on the plants that bronze is going to be on the lower foliage, or it's going to be a magnesium problem. So that's where knowing what the pH is helps you decide what needs to happen to the plant. But this is very classical cases of symptomology. Now, the good news on this is that doing a corrective procedure at this stage, for a quick growing crop, you're generally going to turn it around in about a week. You can regreen some of that foliage if it hasn't gone too far. And so you can turn that around. Whereas, like I said, if you get to the bronzing necrosis stage, if the pH is too low, it is done. That leaf will not be reversed. So this is less of the evils that you could run into. And so here's another classical case with a snapdragon. You can see the effects that's going on. And if it's too high of a pH, you also then can slow down the amount of growth that's occurring. We've seen that, like, for example, with petunias in Calibacoa, that basically, for one of the reasons is you have less photosynthesis happening because the leaves are not effectively green to help on that process in the plant. So growth is stalled somewhat in that plant. So here's an example of the progression from the initial on the left to more advanced in the middle to very advanced and also almost bleaching on the right. And you can get under the bleaching, the advanced stage, sunburning occurring. I've seen that numerous times in the Midwest, like on garden mums produced outdoors in the summer. You'll start getting necrotic spotting going on because there's no chlorophyll there and sunburning does occur on that plant. So some other examples, here's again, upper foliage interveinal chlorosis on a begonia that commonly occurs on that plant. Here's more advanced symptomology that you've gone beyond that interveinal chlorosis to a total yellowing that's occurring in the plant. One would have to make sure you're not running into sulfur problems, but that's really kind of rare. So it's usually a pH, and Bacopa is notorious for doing that. Here are some Calibacoa cuttings. Basically, over irrigation limits, basically you kind of have an oxygen deficiency in the soil, limits the effective uptake of iron from that substrate, and over time you can start seeing iron chlorosis occurring in these plants, and that's what we see here over the entire two flats sitting there. And they were a little older. You can see that they've been pinched. Also to denote that if you get to a different color of plant, like this wax begonia that's red, the plant's not, instead of being red, it's going to go more to an orangey or pink coloration. So, it's still interveinal, it's still upper foliage, that's what you're looking at. And then you confirm the diagnosis with a pH sample to know what's going on. Now, let's go on an exclusion. So here you see a view of all these plants, and there's one sticking out, and there's one that's yellow, and it's smaller. Do you think that's higher pH? Well, no, it's not. In this case, this is root rot. You're seeing iron uptake problems occurring. That's how it's manifesting. But this was Pythium problems with that one plant, that without a root system, it could not pick up iron from the soil. So again, if you go back to that Calibacoa flat, it was everything in that flat is more indicating that it's an abiotic disorder, whereas when you get a disease issue, typically one plant at the beginning is what you're looking at. So again, be aware that determine what the cause is before you make the corrective procedure for that plant. I think this was 2 years ago that we ran through some jade plants. And so I just want to illustrate that, with advanced symptomology, you get down to that bleaching as you see the plant on the left. So then we made some corrective procedures, and you can see the new growth did turn out to have some coloration changes going on, but it was very slow to get the other growth to turn around. So at advanced stages, and it's probably because it's a fleshier plant that has less metabolism going on, you might not have full recovery. So if you have a problem, corrective procedures earlier than later would be a good move to make. So the management wise, just, confirming what the problem is by a pH test, either in-house or send it to a lab, and keeping in mind that low temps, wet growing, and root rots should also be investigated to see whether or not that's a problem for what's going on. And then chelated iron probably is the most effective one. So the rates are in the fact sheets that we provide. So it's all there. It's roughly 4 ounces per 100 gallons of most of the chelating material as a good indication of what to overcome. So then after pH, we're looking now at some of the different elements in particular. And so, of course, what's the element that we add most frequently to plants? And that is nitrogen. And so you see here typical symptomology of nitrogen deficiency, the hydrangea on the left, lower leaf yellowing. There's a little anthocyanin in the leaves. You can start seeing some reddening, some oranging going on too, which may throw you off your diagnosis and making you think that it might be phosphorus, but in this case, it is nitrogen. The streptocarpus in the middle is an overall yellowing, lack of growth, but that's because it's very advanced. And then the sempervivum on the right, over time, you can see the lower leaves are starting to turn yellow and necrotic. And so those lower leaves are going to be lost once they get to that stage. And so the plant's not going to look as nice. So some nitrogen would be very beneficial to that plant. So again, here's the highlight of nitrogen deficiency, overall weak growth, pale coloration on that plant. The sempervivum, a little closer view to see what's going on. And then here's some petunias being held kind of in the flat. You can see lower leaves yellowing, a complete yellowing of that foliage happening. The streptocarpus highlight across the board, and they were just trying to control growth on that plant. So, to overcome the situation, basically try to match up the fertility level with the plant. And some of the fact sheets that we have there, we have a fertilization rate listed. If you are starting to run into problems, avoid excessive leaching or clear water irrigations. Why flush out your fertilizer investment when it's already there? In most cases, a fertility rate with very low leaching of 100 will work. 150 is also adequate, and that's from top irrigation. You can go slightly lower if you're sub-irrigating. It's not uncommon to see 75 part per million N being applied with sub-irrigation, but that's because the fertilizer salts accumulate in the upper part of the pot. And then for a smaller operation, if you only have one injector, and you have a wide assortment of plants in there, and you have heavy feeders like a mum or some of these petunia varieties, excuse me, you can supplement the nitrogen rate with a slow release application to that soil. And so then you can still use the same amount of fertility throughout the rest of the house and just have the bonus amount of nitrogen coming from that slow release material on that crop. So it's fairly easy to correct the problem. So adding an application of around 300 part per million nitrogen once or twice will boost back up that fertility level to help turn back the planter to a better colorations. And again, that's on the corrective sheet guide that we have provided. So another type of problem that we commonly see, especially during cooler growing season or when you're holding plants during the winter, is phosphorus deficiency. What we see is on the lower foliage, we see a purpling going on. But again, phosphorus uptake is inhibited by root when the soil's below about 50, 55. So if you're growing a plant really cold, you can also induce the problem even though there might be adequate phosphorus there, or keeping the soil too waterlogged. In the Midwest, it's very common to plant, the corn comes up, then we get some cool, wet temperatures, and then your corn goes from green to purple until it warms back up, and the plant can then start taking up the phosphorus from that cold, wet soil. So when you look at it, lower foliage, here's on Gerber, it was being grown a little cold to hold it back early in the season. Here's some petunias. Basically, these are plugs that hadn't had a lot of fertility during production, and they were grown quite cold. And so it is interesting that it did not develop on all the cultivars. Actually, that's from my greenhouse this spring. And so it was only some of the cultivars developed symptomology, but I don't know what the stock plant fertility was on those, if they were going in low or not. But you can see the different coloration that's occurring on these plants. These were the spares we had not transplanted into the pots, and we were holding them for 2 weeks before, just to make sure everything for the experiment got set. So you can see the purpling going on. And here's a pansy that this coloration also occurs. Low pH also will look something like this, so you need to know what the pH is, and you typically are growing pansies at a lower pH anyway, so you need to go see what's happening. So I also want to point out that there are variations in the symptomology of phosphorus deficiency. Usually when you're growing things cold and wet conditions, and for plants that have a lot of anthocyanins that help on the coloration, you will see the purpling, which in the case of this lily on the left, you see the purpling going on. But if you're growing them under warmer conditions, phosphorus has different symptomology, and it's this leaf spotting. I call it more of a greasy looking olive leaf spot that occurs, and then it will go yellow. And so that will commonly occur on warmer conditions. And so there are 2 different symptomologies that will happen. We've done extensive work on phosphorus deficiencies, and during the summer, we'll get a lot of the symptomology that's occurring on the left. And if a plant like Calibrachoa is held back with phosphorus, you'll see necrosis of the leaves and yellowing occurring, and never the purpling. And so you can get a lot of defoliation of the lower foliage of the Calibrachoa if you're running the phosphorus too low. So then here, just more of the classic case again: plug, flat, they're growing cold and being held. So you can see that the plant basically is just having a hard time getting the phosphorus taken up from the soil. So if you're looking at phosphorus, a lot of people are trying to control excessive growth by limiting the amount of phosphorus. The sweet zone for most plants is somewhere between 10 and 20 part per million P, probably 10 to 15 for a plant that does not have fruit on it is more than adequate. You start getting below 8 part per million, you're going to start controlling growth. But there's no reason to be applying 20, 30, 40 part per million phosphorus. You're wasting your money, and you're expanding growth. So also keep in mind that low temperatures, wet growing, root rot should also be looked at, because that might be the cause, not that you don't have adequate phosphorus being supplied. So if you need to turn things around, 20-10-20 at 200 part per million N will give you 42 part per million P. And so you can just load up the plant, and it will have adequate levels. From our studies here, if you preloaded the plant, you got about 2 to 3 weeks of reserves in that plant in the soil, as long as you don't leach it out, that you can then carry your crop through. But after about 2 to 3 weeks with no phosphorus being applied, and assuming there's low levels in the plant, you're going to start seeing deficiency symptoms occurring in the plant. So it's kind of finding that sweet spot, but there are a lot of advantages of not over fertilizing with phosphorus, and that's why people are doing it. So then shifting gears here, and it's not overly common, but calcium deficiency does occur. Usually we're providing calcium, usually like in a CalMag formula or a dark weather feed. So we're providing ample levels of calcium to the plant. And so a lot of times when we see problems, it occurs because of environmental conditions. So the plant's unable to get the calcium that's being supplied taken up to the right place as those new cells are starting to expand. And that's what you kind of see across the board with these three examples here. So calcium problems, the one with the zinnia, you can see the tip burn occurring. In this case, it's not as severe as the prior photo. That happens when those leaves are in a whorl protected around that flower bud. And basically what's happening, it's very tight and there's no air circulation or transpiration to help take up that calcium. And the leaf tips lose out to the calcium sink that is the primary area that where nutrition is going, and that's the flower. And so better air circulation may help, just trying to hold down humidity, but this typically happens in a summer crop when you're growing like larger pots of zinnias for color bowls in the summer. So it's really hard to manage that because you have too high a humidity. I have an example there of a tulip. You can run into calcium problems and have blinding going on. But to be fair, there's probably about 5 or 6 other problems that can also occur with the tulip to keep it from flowering. So if you see it go blind, you don't automatically go to calcium. Calcium just is one of the possibilities. And then finally, down at the bottom, you see the stargazer type lily. Notorious, the same thing that went on with the zinnia. When those leaves are around that flower bud and they're still small in the world, there's no air circulation and you're getting that tip burn because the calcium preferentially is going to the flower buds. And so some work that research at that point at Clemson did, if they peeled down those leaves and put a fan on it, so that made, with the fan, it caused more transpiration going on. They solved the problem. So, but that's not practical, but you can see where the root of the problem is, just not getting adequate amount of water loss through the leaves to help with the calcium uptake. And because the whorl's still tight, you can't really do a calcium chloride spray to the plant either. So what of course has happened in the industry is that they're no longer growing the susceptible varieties is what it got down to. There's other ones that aren't as bad as the stargazer variety out there on the marketplace. So again, there's a lot of different reasons why calcium deficiency can occur. So in order to figure out how to solve the problem, you need to know what the cause was. And so most of the times, it's not from the lack of calcium being available, it's the lack of the ability of plant to pick it up. And you have to control that mechanism to control what's going on and avoid a problem. At least a corrective procedure, a 15015, which is heavy on calcium nitrate, should provide ample calcium. On some species, people are still historically using calcium chloride sprays like on Poinsettia brax. People just need to buy good quality calcium chloride. The calcium chloride you put down to de-ice your driveway is not good quality, and you can get leaf burn going on. So again, control the environmental conditions, hopefully will overcome the problem. Good airflow will also help in that situation. Magnesium deficiency is the next one I wanted to talk about. We see this very commonly at the end of the spring season in North Carolina, particularly, in my theory is that when you have your dolomitic limestone added to adjust the pH of the substrate, over the season with irrigation, especially with all the irrigation that has to happen in April and May when it's warmed up, you basically are using up or leaching out your supply of magnesium from your dolomitic limestone. And so then we start seeing problems occurring more readily on a lot more species. Now, there are some species that are just magnesium hungry. A tomato, a gerbera, a poinsettia needs a lot of magnesium. And a pepper. So what we're looking at is the same intervening chlorosis. It looks very similar to what you would expect with low pH. So again, a pH test will help you figure out what's going on. If the pH is up above 5.5, you're going to point more to magnesium. You need to know whether or not you're adding magnesium into the water supply. If you have it in the water supply, like in the Midwest, but you oftentimes see it on a Gerber crop because I think they have a little higher need for magnesium in the plant. Here's also interveinal chlorosis, the lower foliage of a pepper. It's a common symptomology that occurs, especially with greenhouse peppers grown in for the fruit. Here we have symptomology also with heuchera. With it being a chartreuse variety, it's very pronounced, but if it was more of a red variety, it would be, just a lighter pinker coloration with the interveinal chlorosis. And again, it's the lower foliage that it's occurring. Many times potassium can have a close mimic of symptomology too, but as a general rule, it doesn't always happen with potassium deficiency. You also see it at the necrosis going on the middle of the leaf, not as much on the outside margin. And because of most of our fertilizers are very high in nitrogen and potassium, it's very unlikely that potassium will be the problem because we're usually adding it in very adequate levels for what the plants need. So when you're looking at trying to manage a magnesium problem, you need to look to see first how much magnesium you get in the water supply. And then you have to make sure that magnesium is being supplied. It is part of the magnesium water supply. Just the sulfur that goes with it is not in a CalMag formula. And so if you're not getting adequate levels, you need to look at Epsom salts. 1 pound per 100 is a very common practice to do monthly, or typically it's 4 ounces per 100 gallons if you're adding it as a continual feed. But you can't put Epsom salts in the same tank as a calcium nitrate fertilizer because you're going to get precipitate going. You basically get calcium sulfate forming. And so the corrective procedure is 2 pounds per 100 gallons of water. And that works very well. You have to do it when the plant's still actively growing. Like on a poinsettia, if you wait too long and you start getting bract formulation, you can really not turn it around, that interveinal chlorosis. So you have to do it early on in the production cycle to overcome that problem. And then finally, the last set of disorders I wanted to talk about was just overview of some of the distorted growth, because there's a lot of different factors that are out there. It probably gets down to, you got to know what's going on in the greenhouse, and you're probably going to have to send this one into a diagnostic lab. So I wanted to go over some of these different factors. So we have had in the past a lot of problems with broad mites. So you see distortion of that new growth occurring. There's a wide assortment of different plants this problem occurs on. And so again, you could do an in-house diagnosis, but instead of a 20x hand lens, you need about 100x to see the broad mites on the underside of the leaf. And so you would be able to see them. They're just super tiny spider mites, but two-spotted spider mites don't have, or they have you can see their stomachs, the black spots, but you don't see black spots on a broad mite. And then the egg is oval with little indentation pock marks on it. And so that's how you go through and diagnose for a broad mite. Cyclamen mites look somewhat similar. The eggs are different. And so, so again, 100x microscope would help you figure out what's going on if that's a problem. Here's also more advanced symptomology. You can see the distortion going on in some of those petals that have failed to uncurl on this plant. Now, if you're growing scented geraniums, I'd say you probably have crown gall on the plant. A lot of times looking around at growers' plants, we see that it's a bacterial disorder. almost impossible to get rid of once it's in the plant. But that's getting your plant material from a good stock. And then if you're going to do any cuttings, I would disinfect in between cuts of stock plants so you're not spreading the disorder across your supply. Another area where we see distorted growth is a plant growth regulator application. And so, moderate rates of PGRs don't really start having a problem just when there's the overdose conditions. And so you see the stunted growth, you see distortion of some of the flowers that can occur. In the case here, there was some spray over that occurred on begonias when they weren't supposed to be, and you can see how stunted they are because of the plant growth regulator application. A lot of times on some of the even on the sensitive varieties, a BAGA like Fresco or Fascination application of around 3 to 5 part per million will help overcome that problem and get them jump started again. Now, nutritionally, we see boron problems of being thickening and distortion of the growth. You can see the death of the growing tip, and then you see the axillary shoots coming, the secondary shoots happening. So you see similar symptomology occurring also on a pansy crop, which is very susceptible to boron problems. And so that's out there. Doing a tissue analysis because of where things are at, you're probably going to be a little hard pressed to get it diagnosed based on a test because boron's still in some of that tissue. It just might not be where it needs to be in the plant to avoid the plant growth problems that are occurring there. So distorted growth is a little harder to handle because there's a lot of differences in symptomology out there and the causes that occur. And so again, probably you're going to have to go through a diagnostic clinic to figure out what's happening. The good news, with the PDIC at NC State, you can submit a photo sample to the clinic for diagnosis. So, filling out the form, telling the percent of the crop that's affected is very helpful. They still might want a sample being sent in if they can't tell, but that's a good first step to see what's going on with that plant. So when you're looking at trying to manage things, like I said at the beginning, we have developed a number of different resources at Fert, Dirt, and Squirt, the online resource. So if you type in fertdirtandsquirt.org, you will come up to the site, and you'll come up the site even after we migrated over to the new location, because we'll keep that URL. And so at that location, we have the crop sheets there to give you guidelines for crops. There is a database that you can use to determine optimal pH and EC values, also to do a search. And so you also ought to look at doing in-house testing, either through pour-through 1 to 2 or SME, and periodically, just to make sure things are on track of where you need it to be, it'd be a good idea to send in a sample to a diagnostic or a diagnostic clinic, or a more appropriately a plant analysis lab. NCDA in North Carolina, it's only $5 for that sample to go through, just to make sure all your nutrients, because an EC value is the total of all salts. It doesn't tell you which salts are in there. That's why going to a commercial lab will give you that more detailed information that you might need to help overcome a problem that's occurring in your greenhouse. So with that, I want to thank again the American Floral Endowment. They have been the sponsor for Dirt and Squirt for us doing the webinars and being able to do some extension travel. And so I'll open it up for questions.
All right, does anybody have any questions for Brian? Brian, we don't have any questions in the chat, so
okay.
I think you did a great job.
Everyone, you need to wake up. So again, we've spent the time getting the a lot of the resources for the major crops up there for dirt and squirt. So that gives you a resource. But emails. I mean, the clinic is great at NC State, and in North Carolina at least, having NCDA that go through and do analysis is at $5 a sample or free for some of those samples. It's a very inexpensive investment for you to be able to use, because most of the time you're looking at $30 to $40 for a sample. So I'm Amanda, I think you're muted.
Thanks, Brian. So we have a question in the chat that how effective are pH meters that you can buy on Amazon?
Well, pH meters work really well. We use one of the cheaper models. We use the combo meter. I really like the Hanna 9813. I think it's -6. It's under $200, and it's a combo pH EC meter. That's what we use in research. You have to calibrate it each time, but it's the knobs. I like the analog knobs type of approach. I know Hanna has some more fancy ones, but then you got to spend 10 minutes to figure out how to calibrate it. And I guess I'm getting too old, maybe. I don't know that I don't want to do it. I just want to stick it in there, change the knob, EC's 141, I'm good to go. Stick it in the pH, move it till 7, I'm good to go. So for $200, there's a very similar one from Milwaukee Instruments, and they actually are headquartered, I think, in Rocky Mount, North Carolina now. So I don't like the pens, because the pens have historically they're separate, pH and EC, so your cost is equivalent. The batteries are more expensive, and many of them are a royal pain to calibrate. You got to stick it in and then use a screwdriver to get the calibration going. And once we found these 9811, 9811-6, I think, or 9813-6. So the only difference on those, just what units EC is reported on. We do millisiemens, so I want a number of 1.37. A lot of the nursery or hydroponic, or I should say hydroponic ones, sometimes they'll go not in millisiemens. So the EC just reported 1,370. You just would have to move your decimal point in your brain for it to work, but it's the same function. So they work great. We're using them all the time, and we don't go to the more expensive models, because it's a greenhouse. It's going to get busted.
And I'll just mention real quick, sorry to cut you off, Amanda, that we did a training, Danny, Amanda, and I did a training for a lot of the extension agents around the state, and they all, not every agent, but a lot of agents now do have that meter that they can come out and help you with. And then Danny, Amanda, and I also have one of those meters. So if you would want to see that and how it works in person before you would buy one, when it's safe for everybody to travel again, there are folks that can come out and show you how to use it and give you some hands-on help with that.
Thanks, Stacy. Brian, there's another question on the evergreen plant in the nursery that was chlorotic. I would have thought it was missed when the plants were fertilized. How can you tell the difference?
That's a good point. It could be that they I mean, that would be something one would need to look at. If they were applying slow release fertilizer, then one would need to investigate whether or not that's the case. In that particular plant, I went over there and I took it out of the pot and looked at the root system, and that's where I went to root rot. But you're very valid diagnostic situation one needs to look at. That plant actually was it was in Europe and they don't use slow release. So, so everything was through that drip line that was going on there for that operation. But yes, that valid diagnostic situation you need to follow. Good point.
Brian, is there a way that people can get an email when there's a new update on the FERT, Dirt, and Squirt website?
Yeah, all those are sent out via the eGrow. And so we have used the same constant contact email list. So if you go to e-grow.com and under alerts, there's a subscribe button. And then you would get all the updates, no matter if it's the problem ones that we're doing. We started again 2 weeks ago. And then the nutritional ones, we do it periodically, and we send it out through the same mailing list, and you get notification. So so that it's one-stop shop. So e-gro.org, hit a alert tab, then sign in.
Great. Minda Daughtry, who's an extension agent, says that the work at the eGrow site has been invaluable, and she looks forward to all the future research, and it helps her to get growers to see what's happening.
It's been a nice collaborative effort that, you know, there's fewer and fewer applied people available around the US, and it's hard to have an impact when you're by yourself. And so this has kind of given us a community and built some excitement. I mean, greenhouses are specialized, so, you know, and people are scattered. So we just thought that, you know, that was a good way to go. And it, you know, we're at the 10th year of alerts. So it all started with us going over, we went over to Essen IPM, and it wasn't a bar, it was actually a restaurant and a grocery store in The Hague, that we were sitting there in the afternoon doing planning. So it was over coffee. The beer came later. So on the back of a napkin, the idea was born. So 4 of us started 10 years ago. So it would be nice to be over in Holland again someday.
Brian, why do nurseries in Europe do liquid fertilizer rather than slow release?
I think it probably gets back. I mean, it varies. That it was that operation. I think it's going to vary across the board, and I'm not really well educated about the overall practices in Europe. So it may go back to being able to control the fertility in the excess. So but that's a guess. I don't know.
Okay, great. Well, that wraps up all the questions in the chat box. So is there anything else you'd like to say before we sign off?
No, I'm happy to see so many people were interested. It's at least we can still communicate with the webinar. And hey, I think it's the second time in the last like 9 months I got on a button-down shirt instead of a t-shirt, so I had to dress up. So that I didn't go as far as a tie, sorry, in a coat, but
that's fun. I think you're the most dressed up out of any of us.
There you go. Well, I even came into the office, so that was good to get a good connection. So I appreciate everyone coming. So dirtandsquirt.com, and we're going to have it renovated probably in the next week or two, just migrate it over, and then everything starting up. We got a full schedule with eGrow alerts scheduled for the year, and so those will be coming up. So if you want that eGrow alert, sign up, and then it's an auto email. Typically we're sending out Thursday mornings. So all right, no other questions?
I just wanted to say real quick that I put the web link for the pH EC meter in the chat box if anybody wants to hop over there real quick and click on it before we end the meeting.
All right, great. Well, thank you, Brian.
Okay, thanks.
We'll sign off, and we will see everybody tomorrow.
Sounds great.
Have a great day. Thanks so
Thanks.
much.